Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Hard Sell with me, your host, Joel Stevenson. The Hard Sell, we're covering all aspects of sales. We're bringing leading experts, CEOs, founders, sales leaders together to try to explain some of the mysteries of selling so you can achieve better results. Today, we've got a great guest, Mike Massaro, CEO of Flywire. Mike and I have known each other for quite some time now, and he's had just an incredible journey at Flywire. It's one of I would say like the pillars of a successful Boston tech community that keeps emerging. And so, Mike, it's great to have you here.
Joel, thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Yeah, same. So I've got a little bit of inside baseball here, but I'd love for the folks listening to the show to hear the story of the early days of Flywire, and maybe if you could just take us through, the point at which you had joined the company, because I don't believe you were the original founder of the company, like what the model was then, and then how it evolved over time to become now a public, wildly successful fintech company.
Sure, no, happy to. So for those that don't know the Flywire story, over 10 years ago, we were attempting to solve a single use case around cross-border tuition payments. We're a payments company. We focus on these large, typically complex, global type transactions. And really the initial thesis was, hey, can we help students and parents make payments for tuition from overseas? And when you think about it, way back then, the company wasn't even called Flywire at the time. We were called Peer Transfer, believe it or not. And the company had a B2C model. So we were really trying to identify the consumers. There weren't many of them around the world. There was probably 5 million target consumers at the time around the world. And, we knew they had a hard time making these large and complex payments. And so, if you've never done that as a consumer, you'd often have to go to a bank. You'd have to sometimes go in person, make an international bank wire. It was extremely costly. It was highly inefficient. It was super confusing for the average consumer. And so those wires really haven't evolved in, decades. And so we knew there was pain on that side of the user journey. But what we ran into a couple of problems early on, and you're exactly right. Non-founder, I have a 20-year career in enterprise software, billing and payments. And that was kind of part of the core team that had that type of background. And what we saw as a problem with the initial kind of product market fit, go-to-market, was targeting that consumer demographic. Obviously, it was quite challenging, right? You had a limited set of users around the world. Those users were scattered across 100 plus countries, right? Where students originated from. And so you were attempting to acquire those consumers, and it was like focusing, it was a true like needle in a haystack problem, right? Like identifying those users in those foreign countries and targeting them 10 plus years ago, right? You were very limited in what you could do. Even if you could identify them, target them, find a way into that subsector of user group, you then had to educate them on who you were. You had to try and build trust with a foreign company that they didn't recognize, they didn't see around them in their home country in any real way. And at the end of the day, you were trying to educate them for a very tiny window of time in which they wanted to use the product, right? It could be 1 or 2 times a year where they had to make that tuition payment. And so you've got this timing challenge, you've got this branding challenge, you have a user behavior shift that you're trying to change. All of that was extremely complicated. And then even if you can get that user, you have to then somehow convince them in that period of time to trust you with tens of thousands of dollars, right? So which for many families, like that could be a life savings that you're saving for your child's future to pay to send them abroad to study. And so, completely not easy, not something that was set up, for a ton of success, especially when most venture capitalists at the time were looking for active monthly users and growth numbers, right? You're dealing with a very small set of users.
That would probably churn after 4 years, right?
Well, yeah, and you'd have to then go and start and find those incoming freshmen, right? So what we were really fortunate of is that we had a great product team, a great tech team, a great client-facing organization. And at the time, I was heading up sales, marketing, business development, kind of the go-to-market channel. And what we were able to start identifying was that the universities actually had pain points as well. We kind of dismissed them initially and focused on the user pain point, which was significant. But the universities, the finance departments, they had to message students and their parents across 100 plus countries. They had to communicate the ways to pay, which they didn't really understand in the finance department, the whole international wire. What is it like to make an international wire from Korea versus India versus China versus, the UK? They didn't understand the nuances and the difference. Sometimes the terminology was even different in different countries for what that payment method was. And so we started to realize that our clients had pain that we hadn't quite understood. And we started developing not just the consumer side of that experience, but also the client side, the receiving side. How do we help a university collect money from around the world and do it in a much more efficient way? That meant communicating it, reconciling it, posting it to the right financial system, all of those things. And that was really a significant shift to the go-to-market, right? So we could focus on the universities, even a boarding school, language programs, the educational experience, get the biller signed up first. They know who all the payers are, and they can bring you right to those payers with your software, right? And so that was really a huge turning point for the business early on. And it was one of the biggest lessons we had, right? We were so close to product market fit. And frankly, we even had it on the payer side, but it became how do you scale this? How do you scale it in a cost-effective way? And we found that through this kind of indirect, this B2B2C model. And then, since then we've taken that same approach, which is sign up the biller into a whole series of industries, healthcare, travel companies, businesses that have to invoice around the world. Again, always focusing on the biller first, and how can we help streamline how they get paid for these large complex payments. And then, of course, we're streamlining the payment experience, but we're not trying to convince people to use a new way to pay that they may not have heard of before. We're really using that biller's trust they've already developed, and through software, improving that process.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a little bit more about some of those new verticals in a minute, but I'm curious, what was how did you get to the place where, at some point you had a conversation with somebody in the finance department of some university, then there was I imagine there's a light bulb that went off or something. I'm curious how you got from that process of hey, this is too hard with, trying to find the one person in Italy versus going and sitting down with the provost at Harvard or something.
Yeah, I remember, talking to our team and even just looking at some of the direct to consumer marketing spend we had every month. Right. And at the time you were sitting there, and again, 10 plus years ago, for people to get context. Right. So, trying to use a product, whether it's, search, whether it's social media, whatever, to target users in a foreign country. Just imagine the different platforms that now exist in many foreign countries. You couldn't just go to Facebook or Google and just target users. And again, you were targeting them in places that you didn't truly understand, and you were hunting in billions of people for 5 million, right? So that aspect was super obvious to us. It was almost like we were just, taking direct to consumer marketing spend and being like, how could you create a global brand? Coca-Cola has one, McDonald's has one in many of these markets, but we're asking people to trust us with tens of thousands of dollars and trying to do it from a foreign country, right? It's extremely challenging. And so that became this isn't going to work this way kind of moment. Our client facing team, our sales team, our client services, our implementation teams, right? When they got in front of the customer, right? In front of the university, we started to have those conversations. We could talk a lot about the user's pain, and our clients started to see it, right? So all you had to do is tell the same story you knew to already be true from the payer's perspective to the university. And they would say, yeah, I know, because I get emails every time I, open my email box in the morning. I have hundreds of emails from foreign parents having trouble paying. And so they knew the pain point, they validated it. And then they said, but I also have all these problems. This is why I can't, scale it. This is why I can't respond to those, because I get questions coming in Mandarin from Chinese parents, and we don't have anybody speaking Mandarin on staff, right? And so you started to get other ways in which they were struggling with the problem. And that led us to what parts of the software can we build out, or the solution to help address both sides of it, the payer problem and the receiver problem. And that's when we truly hit product market fit.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then I imagine with, education, I don't know, I sort of perceive it as a relatively smaller world where if you start to have success with a few institutions, then you can then start to leverage that with other institutions, either by, I don't know if it was word of mouth or it was just, using, good old, targeting techniques and cold calling, or how that sort of worked.
Yeah, I mean, the industry focus, again, it wasn't our intent at the time. We were just trying to find product market fit for this one use case, right? We hadn't even looked down the road of like, do we go more geographies? Do we go more industries? And so it really was 100% a vertical focus on, can we become the best at, streamlining this cross-border tuition use case? $100+ billion, opportunity. Can we go nail it? And what we started to see over time was, you started to see this opportunity where you could do more, you could develop more capabilities, you could develop more services as well. And that's really where a lot of the great growth came from in the future.
Right. Yeah. And I imagine it was also pretty interesting when you started to first sort of land a foothold here, that it's like you got the freshmen and then they came and paid again as sophomores, right? And then the new freshmen showed up. So you could probably draw some pretty interesting curves from that. Yeah.
It was really interesting because you had this unusual business timing, right? Because we were, again, mostly in the US only at the time. So, most US institutions had 2 peak payment periods a year. And so you actually went through these troughs where there was very little revenue for the business. And then at certain times of the year, really 3 months out of 12, you saw the vast majority of the revenue for the business. And as we added industries, as we added different geographies, we kind of started to flatten out that seasonality. But that was also a huge dynamic for us, was you kind of had this time where you couldn't rev the product that much. And you had to really shift into high gear on go-to-market and sales, because you were only as good as many clients as you could sign up and then get them live before that next big peak period.
Right.
And that was a huge part of the early days, was trying to get that right, because you had such a small window to learn and enhance the product, and to see the changes you made actually pay off for the payer and for the receiver.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So then, you guys did super well in education, and then, you start to look at some other verticals, or like, where are there, big international payments that are being made? So like, maybe just talk a little bit about how you made that transition, like what it took to figure out the first next industry. And then once you did that, was it actually easier to add the third or the fourth? I don't know how far you guys have gotten at this point, but
yeah, we're up to 4. I would say, believe it or not, it came through a sales meeting. I remember my head of education at the time and myself were down at one of our clients, and we finished up, and that senior vice president of finance said, "Hey, have you guys ever talked to a academic medical center? You should meet the CFO on the way out of the meeting of the medical center, because the medical center is the same problem. They have patients come in from all over the world for specialty procedures, and it's a huge pain point. They have no easy way to get paid." And so that was our first, discussion with a non-education related entity. It started in healthcare. Now, for us, it was great because in the payment space, it's a heavily regulated space. You not only need various licenses to move money, but you also need the banks, of course, support in the card schemes and, process credit cards and all that. So again, for us, we happened to pick a very low risk, poorly digitized industry in education, and healthcare happened to fit that mold as well, right? We weren't trying to go into import export. We weren't trying to go into high risk money movement businesses. These were very low risk, always tied to a bill or an invoice. And so it was some of the lowest risk money movement you could do from a cross-border perspective. And so that's really where we started. And then at that time, really our clients in education kept telling us that we should do domestic payments as well, not just cross-border. And the hospitals started to have a huge problem as well around getting paid from domestic patients, right? As more consumers here in the United States had out-of-pocket expenses, their insurance wasn't covering the full medical expense anymore. You started to have a huge gap in the infrastructure that these hospitals had to engage with patients and to get paid. And so that's really how we built the second industry. And I'll tell you, the thing we took away from that experience inside education was really that vertical focus, right? Because, I'd been in a lot of enterprise software companies, and oftentimes people would just shift a sales team across multiple industries. And for us, we learned really on the focus on education gave us a team that understood that industry, cared about that industry, wanted to, sell to people that they had sold to before in that industry. And oftentimes those folks want to build their career focused on that industry. And we found a similar thing in healthcare, right? Where it was almost a whole world in itself. So we had to understand and tweak the product, but we were fortunate because we also realized the importance of having vertical expertise in our sales and go-to-market teams. And so we didn't try and kind of merge one sales team to do both. We actually built almost two different sales, client service, implementation teams focused on one on healthcare, one on education.
And did you find, were you sort of, as you were building out the medical side, were you trying to find people that had already sold into that vertical and understood it? Or were you sort of getting fresh eyes and saying like, here, go figure out this vertical?
Yeah, we tried both. One definitely was less successful than the other. The people that had to learn an industry, the complications are just so much, right? Even inside education, it's the same, right? There's terminology that's different. I remember at one point, being told they don't call them invoices in healthcare; they're statements, right? It's like the nuance of that, right? If you send someone in and they're using the wrong terminology, the clients, the prospects, they know, right? So you could find people who implemented maybe the EHR system where all the patient records are stored, or maybe they implemented an ERP system in the finance department of hospitals, or some of the kiosks and the check-in and the point of sale systems. So again, it was important to understand what are the systems at play that you're going to have to interface to? What are the problems that exist in that industry? And of course, if you have connections already in that industry, having sold a different product or capability or implemented something differently, you again have a whole understanding of an industry that's really hard to teach someone net new.
Yeah. And then how did that work? This is a little bit of a diversion, as more for my own personal edification. But how does then the sales team interact with a product organization? So you've got a product organization that's mostly been building for this other vertical. Now they're going to build for a new vertical. How did information go back and forth there?
Yeah, so years and years ago, we've gotten better at it over time. Wasn't easy at the beginning. 9+ years ago, it was bumpy. But we have a core set of platform capabilities, and think of those as serving up no matter what industry solution. Things like send a notification, store a credit card, do a bank transfer, convert a currency, right? Shared services that you could see used across different industries. Those were really put at a platform level so that you could have a dedicated team that worked on platform capabilities. Same with the money movement. It was shared infrastructure. So you probably had 80% of the tech stack that was set up in a way that was shared, right? And then what you did inside the vertical software is built the end-to-end payment experiences, right? How do you want to tailor the payment experience for a healthcare operator versus a educational institution? What systems am I going to integrate into, right? A student information system, maybe in education, but it could be a patient record system in healthcare, right? Or in travel, it could be a bookings platform with traveler data. So that really became the way in which we segmented. And then as we built out those industries, they ended up having dedicated product teams focusing on the vertical software that was deployed, knowing that the core services were handled by more platform infrastructure teams.
Right. Makes sense. It's interesting. So, I mean, it just sounds like you guys have had a really great flow of information back and forth from the market to your product teams and back to the market again as you've expanded into these different industries. Which I think it's sort of like it's sort of the textbook case of how to build a company versus like barging your way into an industry. It seems like you guys have done it very patiently.
We learned a lot of mistakes over the years. I would say my wife would tell you I make mistakes every day, and we made a lot of them here at Flywire over the last 10 years. But it's that industry focus, that dedication to the clients and the pain points in those industries, and then a great tech team that can help. You can point at those problems and help deliver great innovative solutions. That was really kind of cornerstones of our success in those industries. Yeah,
makes sense. Well, maybe we got time maybe for one more question, and I want to shift gears here a little bit to more of a personal thing. So you had mentioned earlier you sort of joined Flywire running sales and marketing, go to market, all that stuff, and maybe just talk about for people that are in sales that would aspire one day to be a CEO, of either a public company or not. Like, what was that journey like, and what do you sort of think of like the things that you sort of had as strengths as a salesperson or from running a sales organization, and maybe things that you've had to work on a little bit, or if someone was going to try to chart a similar path, how might they do that?
Yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, for me, was a non-founder CEO. I actually found myself stepping into the CEO position just about 9 years ago. And so the company was quite small at the time. As I mentioned, we were trying to figure out product market fit. Just to put it in perspective, it was well under $1 million in ARR. On rate to lose millions of dollars a year. And honestly, wasn't sure I wanted the job. I think I officially declined it twice. And so, for me, it was, I always thought I loved tech. I love, tech companies in general. That's where I really spent most of my career prior to some of those being acquired. And I always kind of thought maybe I'd start something someday, but I always loved working in disruptive tech companies. I definitely never imagined taking over a company, especially one that was struggling to find product market fit at the time. So, for me, if I think coming in from a sales perspective, that background, and I had been a sales engineer, I'd been actually an implementation person for enterprise software, and then moved into sales engineering at some point in my career. Evolved into a direct sales role with a quota carrying of millions of dollars a year. Did that for 6-7 years, and so I kind of had been brought up through technology, kind of educated in the go-to-market process in enterprise software. And so for me, that was super useful, and that I got exposed to technical people who cared about implementations, CIOs and CTOs that you had to make sure the product worked for. And I also got to see, hey, how do you sell it? And then at the same time, be responsible for selling it and then ultimately delivering it too at the other end of it. So that was super useful, especially obviously coming into a place like Flywire, where, you had this software, people counted on it. It was mission critical. It was how these companies, these customers got paid. And so that learning was critical. And to have both the technical background to understand and to work with product, to talk with engineers about challenges that came up, but also kind of that temperature of go-to-market. That was really, really critical for us, because again, that balance I talked about industries and go-to-market. I would say one of the biggest learnings, I think you tossed that out there too. There are probably one or two things. And this I'm sure well. Like, companies break all the time. Like, high growth companies, like, they break. And, my first year or so as CEO, I remember thinking how bad at this job I must be, because the company kept breaking, right? Like, there was something wrong. Like, a day would go by, it would feel great. You'd feel like the company's working perfect. And then the next day it was like everything felt awful, right? Like, systems broke, teams got mad at each other, like things just broke down.
Oh, that's never happened to me.
No, never. Yeah. It's like every day, as I know, So, I always used to think, like, how awful am I at this job that this keeps happening? And then I remember my chairman saying to me once, and it was a massively freeing moment. He only him and my mother call me Michael. So he said, Michael, your job isn't to prevent the company from breaking. Your job is to notice it's breaking and fix it as quick as you can. And for me, like, that was just this mind-blowing moment of realization that the company was inevitably going to break. It's a high growth company. Like, stuff happens, right? Like, you do the best you can, but as you grow, new process, new organizational structures have to come in. And for me, it was just about, hey, okay, now I have to be better at identifying that and trying to get it back on track the best I can. And that was a huge freeing moment. So, I think people who have exposure to different parts of a business, they all kind of have to work together. And so I think if you have a desire to kind of go into more senior leadership, like, I think the great companies are ones where departments learn to work together. Leadership brings people together, and no one's responsible for something breaking. It's how do we all fix it together? How do we make this whole company move in the same direction? And to me, that's kind of the cornerstone of what I learned in the CEO gig in the last 9 years. Yeah,
it's great. Well, I can sort of vouch as having like a little bit of a privileged seat to watch some of this stuff that you've done a great job. It's been really fun to watch. So. Just wrapping things up here, if people want to learn more about Flywire or watch the story, what's the ticker?
Yeah, you can you can look at Inside Flywire. It's our Instagram. That's probably the best way to get a view inside the company. FLYW is the ticker symbol on the NASDAQ, and you can check us out at flywire.com as well.
Yeah, it's great. Well, Mike, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, Joel. Really
Okay,
enjoyed it.
take care.